that the Murphree Wildlife Management Area just sits right on the boundary of the city of Port Arthur. And in fact, Port Arthur is surrounded by a levee system that has a pump system that runs constantly day and night in order to take water out of the city areas and dump it into the marsh. So essentially, Port Arthur, was always kind of this marginal wetland. And so one of the first things I was assigned to do in starting work there was to help with dealing with nuisance alligators in the city of Port Arthur, because very often you'd get a call about somebody saying, there's an alligator in my backyard, there's an alligator in my garage, there's an alligator walking down the street. And so at first, Parks and Wildlife was dealing with most of those calls. So because we were biologists there nearby, we dealt with them. Game wardens dealt with them in other areas, especially around Houston. And so as the population came back, alligators naturally began to disperse. There would be territorial disputes, perhaps between males. It would drive males out from one area and they would just be looking for habitat nearby. And sometimes they'd end up in the wrong places. And so that was a very hands-on process of capturing those alligators using some snares and things and taking them back out to the marsh. And then in other places, you sort of get into conflicts between people that simply feel like that there are too many alligators. And then the third category would kind of be places where perhaps there is sort of a risk to human health because an alligator is showing some behavior that's not acceptable in an area that's very close to people. And this is the scenario that Florida deals with all the time because they have alligators in close proximity to people. There's probably some people who've made the mistake of feeding alligators and giving alligators further comfort in being around human environments. And so those would be sort of three different scenarios. Well, we were hoping that perhaps the harvest would deal with the fact that people felt like too many alligators were in some areas. And in cases where there's an actual risk of an alligator, then we still had to deal with, or alligators in the wrong places, we had to deal with getting them away from that scenario. And so we recognized that it was probably something beyond the scope of Texas Parks and Wildlife being able to handle every alligator. So we developed what we called a nuisance alligator control program, where we contracted with people to remove alligators. And so in some cases, in many of those cases, the nuisance alligator hunter would simply be paid a fee to put the alligator back in appropriate habitat. In other cases, they would be allowed to sell the alligator to an alligator farm. Occasionally, we would allow them to use lethal means to remove the alligator, and then they could take the income from harvesting the alligator. And so those always required Parks and Wildlife to interact with this group of permitted nuisance control hunters. And so that's kind of the point we got to in that process and where Parks and Wildlife still is today.